Welcome back if you're here for the second installment of essay tips and tricks that I have been sharing. Today, I really want to focus on a little bit more information, just again, about some big tips to consider when you're writing and mistakes to avoid in the essay process. So parents, if you're listening in, these are things for you to keep in mind if you're helping guide your student through the writing process. And students, if you are listening directly, these are clearly things that I want you to keep in mind when you're writing. So if you listened to the previous recording when we talked about just generalities of the primary essay, if you didn't, first of all, I would suggest you go back and do that so you get the big picture. And then now let me kind of dig in with you into some of the more nitty-gritty bits and pieces about this type of writing. So I've mentioned before that oftentimes this type of writing can be a little bit of a challenge because it's not something that we are accustomed to doing. First of all, just talking about ourselves, telling stories about ourselves doesn't always come naturally to everyone. Also, it is not the style of writing that most students are doing on a regular basis in school. Those essays and research papers are very different and have a very different structure. And this is an opportunity for a little bit more creativity, a bit more poetic license, if you will, in terms of the narrative and what is being told. And so it doesn't have a rubric. And a lot of times that just makes students crazy because I get it. It's much easier if you have a real set breakdown of what's supposed to be included when you're writing about something. So here's the best I can do for you, sharing what is a general structure of a top-notch college essay. So it starts with a hook, something that is a compelling opening statement that really kind of grabs the reader's attention. I often say that it should give a little hint at what's to come in the story, but it's not going to reveal everything that is getting ready to unfold in the next 500 to 650 words. So again, the compelling hook, that's where we start. Then you're going to have the body. That's pretty simple. It's the narrative. It builds upon the depth of the story and adds meaning to the point that you're trying to make in the writing. And then you wrap it up with a conclusion. It's somehow is sort of reflective and ties everything back together. And that's it. It is really simple. And it's sometimes so simple that, again, students I work with oftentimes are scratching their heads going, I don't know what to do here. How many paragraphs should the body be? How long should the introduction be? Really, if you just think about those three key elements, all of the other nitty-gritty is very fluid. You're also going to pay attention to whether or not it flows. You want to have clear transitions. That's a pretty solid writing tip anyway, to make sure that whatever you're talking about flows in transitions. When you're telling the story, you actually want to be able to show the reader what you're talking about. So what do I mean by that? You are providing details, or the writer is providing details, instead of just making a claim that it's a beautiful day outside. The showing the reader is more of the sun was shining, there was not a cloud in the sky on this beautiful mid-May day. And that's kind of, again, those level of details are what brings a story to life and shows the reader as opposed to, again, telling them. A more common one that would relate to something in an essay could be, I learned a great deal about responsibility. Okay, you probably did as a student, but what do you have to prove that to us? So tell that story, add those details. That's what we're looking for in really compelling essays. I said this in the previous overview of the essays, but you're essentially going to have a claim in mind, something that has happened that you want your story to convey. So I did X, and because of that, I am now this. And that's a very simplified structure, but it could be, I taught swimming lessons to very young children, and because of that, I learned to help people overcome fear. And you tell the story in between that gets you from that claim to the ending, that kind of thing. I know I said this in the very first recording, but the topic is the least important factor in the essay. It is more about the story and the details in between, and whatever the topic is that just gets us going, it it really doesn't matter. I mentioned in the first recording, it could be about the color of mustard, and that would absolutely still be okay to write about if there's a point to that story that relates directly to the student. Don't use humor unless you are genuinely funny. And you may think you're funny, and other people reading it may not think you're funny. So be very careful with humor. For some people, it comes so naturally, and I applaud you for that. If you can write that way and it sounds like you're just talking naturally, great. Then throw the humor in there all day long. But that brings me to the next point. Make it sound like you. As the student writing it, the voice should sound like a student A has written it. So it should sound like a 17 or 18-year-old or 16-year-old has written this work. But it also should genuinely sound like you speak. So I tell students and parents this is important for you if you're helping. It's really important to keep that voice in mind. One of the tips at the very end, and you'll probably hear me say it again, is to read it aloud. And if it doesn't feel like it flows naturally because they're trying to use grammar that doesn't naturally roll off their tongue, for example, that's not a well-written essay. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of I need to sound smarter or more intellectual and use these words, but that oftentimes backfires in this process. And also, before getting started, don't read a bunch of sample essays. That only confuses the matter. It often sets the writers up for feeling inadequate, or that they're not going to be able to match that kind of level of writing. And that doesn't do anybody good in this process. It is not a great idea to read a bunch of samples ahead of time. Plus, it's also just human nature that sometimes we pick up on things and we want to try to replicate it. And this has got to be original work. It really is important that this work is original and very specific to the student writing it at the time. So back to voice, I'm going to expand on that a little bit. I've already talked about don't be overly formal, don't be too robotic, but be authentic and natural. Again, how do you talk? Sometimes when I'm working with a student, I actually have them tell me part of the story to get us started. And I just type it for them as they talk. They can record themselves talking. There are lots of ways to do that so that it is just getting that natural flow of telling a story started, because it is, again, not always natural to get to that point. You want to have some polish, but again, you want to sound like a teenager who is telling us a story about yourself. And some of that means showing your personality. So if humor doesn't work for you, there may be other ways to show your personality in your writing. You may be able to show some emotion, which would be really beneficial and really makes it more genuine when you're telling the story. And then I already mentioned this, but the very final step of editing should be reading the story aloud. And if your students will read it to you or your children will read it to you, that's great. If they won't, that's okay. They just need to do it on their own in the privacy of their room. And even then, not only are they listening for how it sounds in terms of their voice, but it's a great way to catch certain grammar issues as well. For example, a natural pause in how you're speaking, it usually indicates that a comma ought to be put in that particular place. So there's just some things like that that I think reading it aloud can help a student catch in the final phases of editing. And then some mistakes to avoid. I've already touched on a few, but some bigger kinds of things. Don't get caught up in trying to figure out what you think the admissions office wants to hear. I'm telling you, they have read so many essays that it's very hard to pick something that is so unique that they've never heard about it at all. But also, you don't know the person who's going to be reading it. It could be a young 20-something-year-old new admissions counselor who's excited to read everything and will stay awake until 2 o'clock in the morning doing so. It could be somebody who's a little bit more seasoned and has been doing this for a while, who isn't really impressed by much unless you just convey something interesting about yourself. Again, because the topic doesn't really matter in most cases. Also, there can be topics that are risky, could offend people. You have to make your own judgment about how comfortable you feel if you're choosing something that might be politically charged, might state, you know, an opinion that could be seen as pro or con of something like that. Um, I've had students take risks before and do things like write a poem instead of writing a traditional essay. So not so controversial, but just another type of risk. And you just have to calculate for yourself what level of risk you're comfortable accepting in this process. And be sure that you proofread, be sure that you're checking it for grammar, but don't over edit it. And parents, this is really important for us to keep in mind. So I'm speaking directly to you, parent to parent. It is really tempting at times to take the writing and go, I can make this so much better because I've done this for far more years than my child has. But I'm telling you, as a person who has read essays, it becomes clear when it's a parent's writing and their voice is coming across as opposed to that of a teenager. So please bear that in mind and try to resist that urge to fix it. Let their writing stand on its own, because that's really what colleges are looking for in this process. Again, doesn't mean that it can't be polished and you can't help, but avoid really being heavy-handed in the editing process. And new on the scene is the idea of AI. We've got to avoid using that as a tool for writing these these essays. This is really important, and I know it is out there. I know it is a tool that students are using in a lot of ways, both good and bad, but you also cannot know if a college is going to check for whether or not it was written by AI. You cannot know if the AI checker is completely accurate, but the best advice is to just steer clear of it and don't use something written by AI in this process. Years ago, I had a student who was caught for plagiarism, very different type of plagiarism. It was just literally using somebody else's essay, but that got them caught and forced the college to deny them in the process. So those things can happen, and we just need to be mindful of this, and we need to be, as the adults, teaching the teenagers how to be responsible when it comes to doing this. And I know, because I used to hear these things from my child, everybody else is doing it, but you really want to try to hold the line with them on this and encourage them not to do that. So a few more tips. There'll be more to come because essay writing is a broad topic, but hopefully this helps. And if you need more support, obviously reach out to us. We can help you through our packages, and we have a variety of ways that we can support you depending on the age of your student, including an essay-only writing package that can help you as you're entering senior year and the application process. All right, I hope that helps. And if you have any other follow-up questions, I hope you'll reach out and let us know. Take care.